We don't let them play with knives because they'll see you cutting up food and want to help. Well, about the best thing you can do is give them a carrot and a butter knife or something and let them play at it, because they would hurt themselves, wouldn't they? In fact, we sometimes hurt ourselves, even though we know what we're doing and are being careful. There are even adults who should have matured to a certain point that maybe haven't, and still have to follow baby rules. I remember when our whole family learned to scuba dive together at the same time. And our son was, 12, and Deanna was about 14, I think. And at that time, at least he was not allowed to be a full open water diver. I think Deanna couldn't either, because I think you had to wait until you were 15 to be a full independent open water diver. So you had to have an adult with you at all times. And a couple of years later, we were in Hawaii, and so Jonathan was maybe 14, possibly 15 by that time. And there was this couple on the boat with us, scuba diving, and they were brand new scuba divers. They had probably less than 10 dives under their belts. And the woman got separated from the group. And the water was quite clear, and our son, who was 14 or 15, not a very mature adult, saw her at a distance going down. And he caught her, I believe it was about 140 feet. It was well below the 120-foot recreational diver limit. She was into decompression diving at that point. She was also absolutely drunk out of her mind on nitrogen narcosis, which is an instantaneous thing. If you've ever been a diver, you know it can hit you at somewhere around 100 feet, and you're just as drunk as a skunk. People have tried to give fish their mouthpiece because they thought the fish were drowning. You know, you're drunk, and as soon as you come up again, you're okay. Anyway, he catches her at about 140 feet. She had no idea where she was, whether she was going up or down or anything. She was just lost. He brings her back up very, very slowly to try to account for the decompression issues, finally gets her to 15 feet, stays there until they're almost out of air, and then brings her to the surface, saves her life. This is an adult who had been certified as a diver who shouldn't have been alone. She should have been being taken care of, because she did not know what she was doing. So sometimes an adult still has to follow baby rules. And sometimes a child is ready for adult rules. Wednesday night, before services here, I had some extra time, and I thought, well, Levi and Aaron and Paisley and Emily were back in the back eating supper in the kitchen, and I went back and I said, well, I'll just go ahead and set up the table. It's no big deal. I can have it done pretty quick. And they finished up eating, and I'm setting up tables and hadn't done any of the chairs yet. And as they're leaving, Paisley says, can I stay? And I said, that's okay. I'll watch her. It's no big deal. And I figured she'd just play with the tricycles, you know. I mean, she's, 6? She's not 7. That little booger placed every chair, over 100, in position. I would just pull the chairs out, you know, stacked up, and just kind of, you know, unload them. And she placed all 100 and something chairs. Probably saved me 20 minutes. And when I saw that, I said, a little child shall lead them. She had no reason at all to think at that level of maturity at all. She should have been back there playing with a tricycle, you know, but she jumped in, and she didn't just mess with it. I mean, she did the work. And so sometimes it's not the age, it's the maturity on some issues. Now, I still wouldn't let her play with knives and fire even, but she showed great maturity and willingness to work hard. And children, they want to do stuff that you do. But many, many times we can't let them because it's too dangerous. For example, she was trying to unstack the chairs. That was a no-no because she was going to hurt herself, so I did that. But this whole discussion about eating food sacrificed to idols is actually going to come up again in chapter 10, which I've already mentioned last week. But he says in verse 9 of chapter 8, be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. And then down in verse 11, he says, this weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. So you have to be careful. Verse 12, when you sin against them in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. So we have to be very, very careful. It's very similar to Romans 14. You know, he's talking about eating food and eating meat and drinking wine and everything, and he says there are people who just can't handle that, and you don't want to destroy the weaker brother or sister because of that. So be very, very careful how you exercise your rights. You have the right not to exercise a right, okay? You don't have to exercise a right. You have the right not to exercise a right, and you need to be careful when you are doing that. In chapter 9, he's still talking about rights here, but he kind of does a shift on us, and he starts talking about himself. And he says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. I'm getting the impression some people thought he was a shyster or something, you know. In fact, it's going to sound even more like it as he goes on here a little bit. But he says, apparently somebody was criticizing him. And we're going to find out some of why they might have been criticizing him here. But he says, you know, I'm an apostle. And even if I weren't an apostle, I'm an apostle to you because of what I've done with you. And he says in verse 3, this is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Okay, so somebody is trying to give him a hard time. And I'm calling this section different standards for preachers and regular members of the church. Bill, you don't know anything about that, do you? Different standards for preachers and members, or other regular, or as they say, the laity versus the clergy. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink other than just Sunday fried chicken? Don't we have the right, and now the NIV here says, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us? I think the King James Version is probably a little more accurate. It says, don't we have the right to lead about a sister? As do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas, Peter. I don't know why he pulls Peter out. Peter was married, and we knew that, but it's odd that he separates him out from the other apostles. Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right not to work for a living? Okay, so he's talking about, don't I have the right to the necessities of life? Don't I have the right to have a wife? And he has something to do with working for a living versus preaching full time. It's interesting that he points out, he classifies Barnabas with him and the apostles. And in fact, Barnabas definitely was an apostle, even though many people don't list him as one, because Acts 14:14 says something about the apostles, comma, Paul and Barnabas, comma, and kept going. So Barnabas was considered an apostle, close associate of Paul, and so they were classifying Barnabas along with Paul, and he says, am I and Barnabas the only ones who lack the right not to work for a living? Now he's going to expand on this a little bit. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Very few people. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Do I say this merely on human authority? Now he's going to give some examples from the Old Testament, which we would not necessarily, in some cases, see as clean analogies, but he uses these as analogies. The first one is pretty good. He says, do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? Okay, let's hear what the law says. For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the corn. I think we've all heard that before. Don't muzzle the ox that's treading the corn. So, and you know that what they did is they had a pole that was on a circle, and the ox would be yoked to that pole, and the ox would walk in a circle around, and they would put the corn or whatever on the ground, and the ox would walk on it and break it up in a way for them. It was kind of a way of separating the corn out. Maybe it was their early version of a corn cob shucker, not shucker, but a corn cob cleaner. Have any of you ever taken a corn cob of dried corn and put it in a handheld corn cobber and ground it and had the corn fall out and the cob go off on this? That is more fun than a barrel of monkeys. I used to do that when I was a kid at one of my relatives' house, and it was a blast. But anyway, it says, yeah, I didn't know it was work. I was only about 10. I thought it was fun, and I'd do like 100 of them, and they'd go, oh, you can do that all you want. I don't care. Anyway, he says, don't muzzle an ox while it's treading out the corn. This actually has two applications. Number one, he says, is it about oxen that God is concerned? Yes and no. It's unkind to make an animal walk in food and not let it eat. That's cruel. It's just disrespectful to the animal. But in addition to that, he says, this is actually for us. He says, surely in verse 10, he says, surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in hope of sharing in the harvest. If we've sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right, and he's already mentioned the others, if others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more because I spent so much time on you? I'm adding this because I spent so much time on you. I guess another way of saying it, if others have this right to support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more since we brought Christ to you or brought you to Christ? I'm not just an itinerant preacher. I actually brought you and Christ together. This is a clear example of having paid preachers. There's scripture to support having paid preachers or paid ministers or paid elders or stuff like that. If a person works full-time in ministry, they should derive if they don't have another job to support themselves, they really should be paid. And Paul says here in verse, it's halfway through 12, but we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with, now this is almost sarcastic sounding, on the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Remember, he's just been talking for a couple of chapters about doing things that cause weak people to have an issue, and he's going to expand on this even more here in a minute on what we should be doing and how we should do it with regard to the cause of Christ. I'll put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who serve, now he's going to go back to the Old Testament and to the temple, which is still standing at this point. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple? Now he's primarily talking about the Jews, but this is also the case in the pagan temples. And that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar. In the same way the Lord has commanded, and we don't have this reference anywhere, in the same way the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. So he's saying, look, if I work full time in the gospel, I should get support. And he did get some. He did get some. But as a general rule, he did not take support. He worked as a tent maker, and he would work, for a couple of days making tents or whatever, and then he would preach for a few days, and then he'd go back to making tents again. And these were not pup tents. These were serious, semi-permanent tents for soldiers and things, from what I've read was the case. I have a note here. I can't read my own writing. He says those that serve in the temple get their food from the temple. I can't remember exactly where it is. Bill, you might remember it. The Jews, the Levites in the temple, they would cook some of this meat in big pots, boil it, or roast it, or what. Remember, I told you it was more like a tailgate party and a barbecue than it was where you just completely sacrificed the animals. Most of the time, that wasn't the case. They didn't destroy the animals. They usually ate it. And the servants in the temple had a big fork that they were allowed to poke down into the meat, and whatever came out, they got to keep. Well, you can guess how they designed those forks. So that when they went down in there, they got most of it out. But they were allowed to poke down into the meat with a big fork that they had made. Yes, Bill?
They also got a portion of every type of offering that was brought to the tabernacle or the temple.
Expand, please.
Well, if they brought, say, a bushel of wheat, then there was a toll that was taken that belonged to whoever was serving at that time.
A fraction of the wheat would be given to the temple servant.
You know, whatever was brought. These were called flesh hooks that pulled the flesh off.
Okay.
And we understand that it wasn't the same priest there all the time. They circulated through.
Even Zechariah, isn't that the father of John the Baptist? Yeah, it said it was his time to serve. Okay.
And so this is the way that they were furnished. You have to remember that was a smaller tribe than any other tribe.
And they didn't have any land.
They didn't have any land, and this is the way that they received their inheritance.
Okay. And it wasn't just wheat. They would sometimes bring wine. Sometimes they would bring made bread, the showbread, and things like that. They would bring all kinds of sacrifices. In fact, sometimes people talk about Cain and Abel, and they said, well, you know, what did Abel bring to God? He was a shepherd. What did he bring to God?
Evidently a lamb.
A lamb or some kind of animal. And what did Cain bring? He was a farmer. He brought the fruit of the ground. Everybody says, well, his sacrifice was not acceptable because it wasn't a lamb. It had nothing to do with that. It was here, the problem. Because the fruit of the ground was also acceptable to God as a sacrifice. But it was the heart that was the problem. It keeps going back to that. I don't like that, because if I pay attention to my heart, I do different things than what I want to do sometimes. Okay, so he says, as an example, those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and they share in the sacrifices. And the same way, preachers of the gospel can receive their living from the gospel, from preaching the gospel. But, verse 15, I have not used any of these rights. And I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. Here comes the sarcasm again. For I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. Now that sounds wrong right there, but you have to read the next sentence. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. I'm just an unprofitable servant, as an example. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. Paul worked hard to not cause trouble if he could help it. Really, really hard. And this is an argument that he's making, that, you know, we really have to try our best to bring the glory to God and not allow people to say, well, they're just doing it for the money, or, you know, there are all kinds of things that people will come up with. And so he's working very, very hard not to cause a problem. And he's going to continue here, verse 19. Though I am free and belong to no one. He's going to kind of wrap this up here in a minute, and so we'll get the whole point of it. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. Okay, there it comes. To the Jews, I became like a Jew. Well, he is a Jew. To win the Jews. To those under the law, which is still the Jews in my mind, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, being a Jew, some people would disagree with him on that. So as to win those under the law. So I became one under the law, even though I'm not under the law, so that I can win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but under Christ's law. So as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become, now this is very famous, I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I can save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. So he's been talking about this idea of giving up rights for some time now, for several chapters. I have the right to do a lot of things, but sometimes it's better just not to exercise that right because it's more beneficial for the gospel for me to do it another way. And this whole teaching here about becoming a Jew to the Jews, becoming a Gentile to the Gentiles, becoming one who is not under the law for those who don't have the law, becoming weak for the weak, This is kind of interesting because we don't like to modify our behaviors, do we, to accommodate other people. I think I've mentioned to you before, my father, Jack Lochamy, his name was Joseph Clyde Lochamy Sr., which unfortunately made me Joseph Clyde Lochamy Jr. But anyway, he was always known as Jack. He was an insurance salesman for most of his, about 30 years of the latter part of his life before he retired. People loved him. And the reason they loved him is when he walked into a room of country people, he became a country person. He talked like country people. He acted like country people. He used country people, aphorisms and things. He just became them. If he walked into a room of educated people, he suddenly looked really educated. I was shocked because he only had about a 10th grade degree, 10th grade education, but he could really act sophisticated at times when he was around sophisticated. The ones that really blew my mind was when he was around a group of Jewish people. He suddenly acted and sounded just like a Jew. Or if there was a black family around, his culture just suddenly became their culture. This is kind of like what Paul was doing. Now, he wasn't putting on, he just did it naturally. He just sort of fit in. And because of that, people trusted him because he was one of them. And I think Paul's kind of talking about that here. You don't want to go in and talk to the poor, uneducated people in your finest clothes and with your best English and your biggest words, because you're not going to relate to them, are you? You have to get down in the dirt with them. You got to be poor and uneducated to talk to the poor and uneducated. You got to try to understand the culture of the person you're talking to. If you're talking to a person from India, their culture is very different than ours. You can't use the same words and the same concepts and the same analogies with them. If you're talking to an Islamic person, your religious talks are not going to make a lot of sense to them. You're going to have to almost get into the Islamic faith to help them understand what you're trying to say. But yet, Aiko, I'm sure you've experienced this in the past. People will talk to a Japanese person that doesn't speak English, and if you're from Texas, you say, "How much is this?" And the person is looking at, "How much is this?" Okay, they don't understand what you're saying. You're not speaking Japanese, and if you say it louder and slower, that's not going to help, is it? You have to speak Japanese to that person, or whatever language that person speaks. And if you're dealing with a very different culture from your own, you're going to have to get into their culture, or you're not going to make any progress with them. In fact, if you're just wanting to be friends with them, you kind of need to get into their culture and sort of try to understand it. That doesn't mean you have to adopt their culture. There was a preacher here several years ago, I can't remember, and he talked about going down to the bars. to talk to people about Christ. And he said, I had to order beer and drink it. I hope he got a good one. But he said, I believe the Lord loves me for sitting there and drinking a beer with those guys, because they can now relate to me and I can relate to them. You don't want to do sinful stuff. You don't want to go to a prostitute's house and engage in prostitution, but you need to understand where that person is coming from and be able to relate to what's going on with them. That's what Paul is saying here. I became a weak person to save the weak. I became a Jew to save the Jews. I became a pagan. And you notice he kind of qualifies it a little bit here. Though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law. He kind of qualifies when he's talking about people not under the law. He says, I still have a law there, but I have to become more like them and be able to work with those kinds of people. And I mentioned to you how he would quote from the Athenian poets and writers instead of from Scripture when he talked to them. Because they couldn't relate to the Scriptures directly, but they could definitely relate to their famous poets. And so he walked in on that sort of thing. He didn't come in, red-faced and screaming, you're all a bunch of pagans and you're all going to die in sin and everything. He related to them in their culture and in a way that would make some kind of sense to them. So I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. Now he's almost sounding like he's doing it for a selfish reason there. He wants to share in the blessings of the gospel, and so he feels like that is his reward for doing this. Do you not know that in a race, we're still talking about this sort of thing, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. I love the walking aimlessly. In physics, there is something called the drunkard's walk. And you have a point where the drunkard is standing. And you give the drunkard random instructions. You let the drunkard walk. You assume they are just statistically walking randomly with a certain pace, distance, and so many steps and things. And you can actually mathematically calculate how far they will be from the starting point, statistically. But it won't be the starting point, and it won't be in a straight line because they're just wandering around. But there's a mathematical formula for calculating how far a random motion will be from the origin after so many steps or so many sequences. And he's saying, that's not what we're doing here. I'm not shadow boxing like a boxer gets out there and fights the air and everything. He says, I am paying attention to what's going on. I am a slave. And he's actually, I believe, going to continue this. Yep. In chapter 10, he says, for I do not want you to be ignorant. He says this in a couple of places throughout his letters. I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud. Remember the cloud from God during the day? And that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized. These are high Jewish analogies. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food, the manna and the water that came from the rock, and drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Now that is a huge backwards analogy. Their drinking from the rock is analogous to our relationship with Christ. Christ is our rock. We drink spiritual water from Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things occurred, here we go, as examples, to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. I think the King James Version says, and they got up to play, I believe, which I always thought was an interesting way of translating that. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did. Now there's that interesting, they were testing Christ 1,800 years before Christ was born, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. Remember the snake on a pole? The snakes came into the camp and would bite them, and it was a fiery bite, and they would die from it. And so Moses made this bronze snake wrapped up on a pole, and he put it in the midst of the camp, and if you got bitten, now he didn't take the snakes away. He was still punishing them, but if you got bitten by the snake and you looked at the pole, you would live. 500 years later, they still have that snake on a pole in the book of Judges. They're worshiping it. See how things can get out of hand? They're worshiping the snake on the pole. Guess what the snake is today? It's the sign of medicine, isn't it? The snake on the pole is the sign of the medical profession. Jesus is even, I forget where it does the example, but Jesus is even compared to the snake on the pole. Like the snake on the pole was lifted up, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. So in a way, it's very strange how that analogy is made, that Jesus is like a snake on a pole, but they actually do make that analogy. But so he's saying that, they were doing all these things, and these were examples, verse 6. These were examples for us so that we would understand what we should be doing. These things happened to them, verse 11. These things, this is the second time he's saying it. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. Christ is the culmination of the ages. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. Does that remind you of Proverbs 16, verse 18? Everybody's heard pride goes before the fall, or goes before a fall. That's not technically the correct translation. It's two pieces. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Pride and a haughty spirit are basically the same thing, I guess. And the Jews are good at that. They will say the same thing twice with different words to emphasize it. But the idea of, if you're so proud or you're so haughty, you better be careful, because you're going to step in a hole at some point, and you're going to be in trouble. This teaches humility. I taught a class one time on finance in Charlotte at the, oddly enough, the Providence Road Church of Christ. Providence Road keeps coming up no matter where I go. And one of the ladies in the class was married to an extremely successful veterinarian. And they were rich. I don't know why she was taking the class. But anyway, she made it abundantly clear that it was impossible to live on the amount of money I had told them to allocate. We were doing a budget for a family of 4 living at the poverty level. And I said, you can do this. You can live on a family of 4 poverty level budget. Not well, but you can do it. I want you to make a budget for everything for this family of 4 to live on, and tell me how they're going to eat, what they're going to drive, where they're going to live, and all that stuff. And I said, I'm going to do it too. And I had allocated, I believe, $50 a month. At the time, that would work, by the way. It won't even work in a week now. But at the time, $50 a month could actually, if you were careful, would feed a family of 4. She said, well, that's impossible. Nobody can live on that. And I thought, yeah, you probably never in your life had to actually save money or try to save money. And I actually put out the menu and the grocery list and all of the food. And I said, see, there you can do it. Oh, it's just impossible. Okay, let's not be too proud of the fact that we are comfortable. We should be humble about the fact that we have enough food, and that we have transportation, and that we have homes that we can live in, that we're cool in the summer and warm in the winter and protected from the elements. Those are things a lot of people don't have. How many people have you seen, though, that complain because their steak had a little piece of gristle in it in the restaurant? Thank God you can get steak. Personally, I prefer ground beef because I can eat all of it and not have to worry about the gristle. And I can cut it with a fork. But let us be thankful and humble and not arrogant and haughty toward other people. Some people are born smart, some people are born dumb. Okay, the smart person shouldn't think they're better than the dumb person because you both were born that way. You had nothing to do with it. Some people get rich, some people don't. Sometimes we're just lucky, sometimes we're smart and we get rich. There are lots of things that affect our lives, but we shouldn't take credit for all of that. In fact, God even talks about that in the Old Testament. He says, when you get into that land and you get fat and things are going your way and your grapes are growing like crazy, don't say, I did this with my own hand. He said, I gave you the ability to do that. So don't get haughty. Don't get snooty. Be humble. And he's saying that here. Be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has and being haughty and prideful is a huge temptation. It's hard to fight. No temptation or testing, the word can go either way. I think Levi even alluded to that when he was talking about Temptation Sunday. Has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted or tested beyond what you can bear. But when you are tested or tempted, He will provide a way out so that you can endure it. So we're really, really right at the end of class today. And we will take up with verse 14, I guess, next time. And he's going to go back to the idol feasts again, and he's going to compare them to the Lord's Supper, which will be an interesting comparison here. But he's actually going to go back to the subject of eating food sacrificed to idols and things like that. So apparently it was a big issue. Okay, so I haven't heard the bells, but I'm assuming it's happened because it's 10:15. So may the Lord give you His great blessings that He gives you every day. And as He blesses you, may you in humility accept those blessings and share them with other people, and thus bring glory to Him and an eternal crown of life to yourself through Christ our Lord.